The knife was 4 inches long, with a wooden handle worn smooth from 3 years of being held in the dark. Wren Calloway sat cross-legged on a flattened cardboard square in the service tunnel beneath 34th Street and ran the blade across the whetstone she kept hidden behind a loose brick in the east wall. The motion was slow and deliberate. Each pass the same length, the same angle, the same quiet scrape of steel against stone. She had done this so many times that her wrist no longer thought about it. Her wrist simply knew. Above her, the city was asleep, or as close to asleep as New York ever got, which was not very close at all. She could hear the rumble of a late train somewhere to her left, and the drip of something from a pipe overhead, and the distant percussion of a garbage truck 2 blocks east, working its way down 9th Avenue. She had learned to read the city by its sounds the way other children learn to read books. She knew what hour it was by the quality of the silence. She knew what the weather was above ground by the way the cold came through the tunnel grates. She knew without looking that it was 20 minutes before 4 in the morning, that it was cold and dry above, and that she was as she was every night at this hour, completely alone. She lifted the blade and held it level in the thin strip of light that fell from a grate 20 feet away. The edge caught the light like a line drawn in silver. Good. She folded the knife and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat in the space she had sewn shut on 3 sides so it would not shift when she ran. Then she did what she did every morning before the city woke up. She said his name, not loudly, not with the kind of rage that burns hot and quick and exhausts itself. She said it the way a person says the name of something they intend to finish. A quiet word with a long shadow. Dorian Alcott. 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days since the night she had first heard that name. And every morning since she had started the day here in the dark with the knife clean and the name on her lips, because those 2 things were the only compass she had. Everything else in her life had been taken or lost or left behind. But the name and the knife were still hers. She was 9 years old. She did not think of herself as brave. She did not think of herself as anything in particular. She thought of herself as a person with a job to do, and she intended to do it. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for the day to begin. The night had ended. It had been raining since noon. Wren remembered that clearly because the window in the kitchen had leaked all afternoon, and her mother had set a soup pot on the sill to catch the water, and Wren had watched the pot fill up slowly while she sat on the kitchen floor doing the word puzzles her mother had cut out of a newspaper and saved in a small yellow envelope. The pot was almost full by the time June Calloway came home from her shift, and her mother had laughed when she saw it and said the pot was more useful on the sill than it had ever been in the cabinet, and that had made Wren laugh too. Her mother smelled of garlic and dish soap and the particular exhaustion of someone who had been on their feet for 10 hours. She pulled off her shoes at the door the way she always did. She checked the refrigerator the way she always did. She sat on the edge of Wren's bed while Wren ate the half portion of tiramisu her mother had carried home wrapped in 2 napkins in her coat pocket, and she invented lives for the people she had served that night, because June Calloway believed that everyone at a restaurant table had a story, and that the best gift a waitress could give a child who could not afford a library card was a story before sleep. But that night June had come home earlier than usual, and her hands had been shaking when she poured herself a glass of water, and she had gone into the bedroom and spoken quietly on the phone for a long time, and her voice had a tone in it that Wren had never heard before. Not the tired voice, not the careful voice she used with the landlord, something older and more frightened than either of those. At 2 in the morning, the knock came. It did not ask permission, it announced itself. 3 hard strikes against the door that said whoever was on the other side had already decided what was going to happen next and was giving the door one chance to cooperate. Wren felt her mother's hands before she saw her. June Calloway was already at the edge of her bed, already pulling her up, already carrying her half asleep down the hall toward the closet by the front entrance. She smelled of rain and fear, and her grip was the tightest Wren had ever felt, all the way to the back, behind the winter coats. Do not make a sound, no matter what. Wren, no matter what you hear. The closet door closed. The dark was complete. Wren pressed herself against the back wall and pulled her knees to her chest and felt the wool of her mother's old peacoat brush against her cheek like a hand trying to offer comfort. She heard her mother's voice at the door, calm, unnaturally calm, asking who was there as though she did not already know. She heard the door open. She heard a man's voice, low and businesslike, and almost polite, the way a voice is polite when it does not need to raise itself to make its point. He said they needed to talk. He said it was about a phone call, He said it the way you would say the weather is changing. She heard her mother say there had been a mistake, a terrible mistake. Her voice cracked at the edges of the word terrible. She heard another man farther away asking about a conversation with someone from the federal building on Worth Street. Her mother began to explain. And then there were sounds Wren did not understand at first. A lamp falling, something hard striking something soft. And then her mother's voice cut off in a way it had never cut off before mid-sentence, mid-breath, as though someone had simply reached over and closed a book. Three sounds followed. They did not sound like the movies. They were small and flat and muffled. They sounded like books falling from a high shelf one after the other, and then silence. And then footsteps moving quickly down the hall, and then the front door closing, and then nothing but the rain on the window. Wren did not move for a long time. She did not know how long. She counted things in the dark because counting was the only thing she could think to do. The number of coats hanging above her, the number of drips from the kitchen window she could still hear from inside the closet. She counted until the number stopped meaning anything, and she was just moving her lips in the dark. When she finally pushed through the coats and walked down the hallway in her bare feet, the kitchen light was still on. The soup pot was still on the sill. The yellow envelope with the word puzzles was still on the floor. The pink rug in the living room, the one her mother had bought at a thrift store on Nostrand Avenue, because she said every home needed something that was a different color now. A color Wren could see but could not name. Her mother was on it, her right hand was open, and in the palm of that hand, crumpled from being held tightly and then released all at once, was a piece of paper torn from an order pad, 3 words in her mother's handwriting. The handwriting Wren knew better than her own. It said, "Do not forget," and beneath it underlined twice with a pen pressed hard enough to tear through the paper Alcott. Wren stood there for a very long time. She did not cry. She looked at her mother's face, and she looked at the paper in her mother's hand, and she understood with the kind of clarity that comes only when everything else has been removed that she was now entirely alone in the world, and that there was one thing left that she was supposed to do. She picked up the piece of paper. She folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her pajamas. She walked back to her room, pulled on her jeans and her sweater and her sneakers, and she walked out the front door of the apartment for the last time. She was 6 years old. She did not look back. The city took her in the way cities take in the unwanted. Not warmly, but completely. She spent 11 months in a group home in a part of Queens where the buildings looked like they had given up. The other girls there had hard edges and harder eyes, and within the first week, one of them had taken Wren's only photograph of her mother out of her pillowcase, and Wren had not gotten it back. She learned from that not to keep things where other people could reach them. She learned to sleep facing the door. She learned that the staff were not cruel about it, but that their kindness had office hours and did not apply after 8 in the evening. On a Thursday in spring, she walked out a side door during a fire drill and did not go back. She was 7 years old, and she had a folded piece of paper in her pocket and a general sense of the direction of Manhattan. Everything else she built from nothing. She learned the geography of the city's underside the way a person learns a language when they have no choice but to speak it. The service tunnels in the steam corridors, in the particular overhang at the 42nd Street exit of Grand Central, where the draft came through from the south and kept the coldest nights bearable. She learned which restaurants put their kitchen scraps out early and which ones left them locked. She learned which churches left a side door unlatched. She learned which security guards looked the other way and which ones did not. She went to the public library on 5th Avenue 3 days a week. She sat at the computers in the back, and she read every article she could find that mentioned the name Dorian Alcott. She read the old issues on the microfilm machines when the articles were too far back for the digital search. She found 12 years of him assembled the way you assemble a person from photographs and secondhand accounts. His family had arrived from Palermo 3 generations back and had built their first business on the waterfront of Red Hook before the war. His grandfather had expanded into construction. His father had expanded into everything else. Dorian had inherited at 31, after his older brother was handed to the federal government, on a tax case that was not really about taxes, and in the 7 years since he had doubled what he inherited and made the Alcott name mean something in 4 of the 5 boroughs that it had not meant before. There were photographs, most of them taken at distances through long lenses, by photographers the subjects did not know were there. A man in a dark suit leaving a building on Mulberry Street, A man at a funeral standing slightly apart from the others, hands folded in front of him, face directed at the ground, but eyes somewhere else entirely. A man getting into a black car outside a restaurant in Midtown, half turning at the last moment as though he had heard something no one else had heard. Ren studied that face the way other children studied multiplication tables. She learned the scar along his jaw, which ran from the hinge to the chin and had faded to the color of old paper. She learned the set of his shoulders and the particular angle at which he held his head when he was thinking. She learned his face in bad light and good light and in the grainy gray of surveillance photos. She learned it until she could have drawn it in the dark. She needed to know his face before she could do what she had come back to the city to do. That fall, she met Garrett. He was living in the steam corridor below 34th Street in the section that ran beneath the old post office, and he had been there long enough that the other people who moved through those spaces left his corner alone. He was a large man who had become a thin one with a veteran's discharge papers in a Ziploc bag in his inside pocket, and a way of sitting very still for very long periods that suggested he had once been trained to wait without moving. He had a bad leg from a desert operation he referred to only as over there, and he did not elaborate, and Ren did not ask. He noticed her the way quiet people notice things, which is completely and without announcement. For the first week, he said nothing. He left half a sandwich near her sleeping spot on 2 occasions and did not acknowledge it. She ate both. On the 8th day, he said without looking at her that she was holding her folding knife wrong, and if she wanted to know how to hold it right, she should sit across from him at a time of her choosing. She sat across from him the next morning. What he taught her was not how to fight. He was very clear about that. He taught her how to hold a thing so that the tendons of her wrist did the work, instead of the muscles of her arm which tired. He taught her where the geometry of the human body allowed for a small blade to matter. He showed her on his own arm tracing lines with the tip of his finger, explaining angles the way a geometry teacher explains angles. He did not ask why a 7-year-old needed to know these things. He had seen enough of the world to understand that some questions were a luxury. He taught her other things too without being asked. How to read the direction of a room from the way the air moved when a door opened. How to make herself smaller in a crowd not by crouching, but by rearranging her attention. How to read the shape of words on someone's mouth from a distance of 15 feet. That last skill took her 6 weeks to develop and became the most important thing she had. She sat in coffee shops and libraries and subway platforms and practiced until she could read lips, the way a musician reads sheet music quickly and without effort, catching the melody of a conversation from across a room. She sharpened her knife every morning with a stone she kept behind the loose brick in the east wall of the tunnel. She said Dorian Alcott's name every morning before she went up into the city. And she waited with the particular patience of a person who has decided that waiting is just another form of work for the moment when her preparation would become her purpose. She had been waiting for 1,095 days when she walked into a coffee shop on Chambers Street and sat one table away from 2 men she recognized as employees of Dorian Alcott and heard without meaning to the word she had been listening for. Wedding. It was the 3rd week of October, and the trees in City Hall Park had gone yellow and orange, and the light came down through them in pieces. Ren had come in for the warmth and a cup of water and had chosen her seat out of habit in the corner facing the door with her back to the wall. The 2 men at the next table had the particular bearing of people who were certain they were not being watched. They were wrong. They had ordered lunch and they were talking without monitoring their volume, because why would anyone monitor their volume in a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon? She did not look at them. She read the newspaper she had picked up from an empty table and let her eyes move across the page at a natural pace while her ears did the actual work. 2 weeks. The wedding was in 2 weeks. St. Patrick's, which Ren understood to mean the cathedral on 5th Avenue. The honeymoon was somewhere with a lake. The other man said something about the arrangements being tight, which meant the window was tight. Not the honeymoon window, some other window. She could not hear the rest. She folded the paper and left. She stood on the sidewalk outside and let the October air cool her face and thought through what she had just heard with the deliberate precision of someone who has been living according to a single plan for 3 years. 10 days at a lake, a private flight, a ceremony at one of the most photographed churches in the city. Alcott would be surrounded and visible, and then he would be gone, and getting to a man at a lakeside resort was a different problem than getting to one in a city where she knew every underpass and service tunnel and anonymous crowd. She needed to do it before he left, but first she needed to see him. She had studied his face in photographs for 2 years. She had never seen him in person. There was a difference between knowing a face and knowing a person, and she had learned enough about herself in 3 years on these streets to know that she would not be certain, truly certain, until she had stood close enough to see what his eyes did when they were not being photographed. That week, she began to follow Sylvia Hargrove, not Alcott, his fiancée. She had found Sylvia's name in a society column 3 months earlier, attached to a photograph taken at a charity event on the Upper East Side. The article said the couple had been together for 2 years, that Sylvia came from a family in Chicago, that the wedding would be at St. Patrick's in the fall. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair pinned back, a perfect smile, and the particular posture of someone who has spent their life understanding that rooms are watching. Wren had looked at that photograph for a long time before setting it aside. There was nothing wrong with it. That was the thing. It was a completely convincing photograph of a completely convincing woman in love. And Wren had spent enough time observing people from below the line of their attention to know that convincing and genuine were not the same word. She followed Sylvia for 4 days. Not closely. Wren had learned that the greatest distance at which you could observe a person was the safest, and she had learned how to use the geography of a street to hold a sight line from half a block away. She watched Sylvia at a lunch in the East 70s, at a boutique on Madison, at a gallery opening in Chelsea. She watched the way Sylvia moved through rooms and the way she held herself differently when Alcott was present than when he was not. On the 5th day, Sylvia went to lunch at a restaurant on the Upper East Side. Wren took a table outside the window tucked behind a planter with a cup of hot chocolate and a clear line of sight to the window seat where Sylvia had been placed by the maitre d'. She was reading the menu, and then she was not reading the menu because a man had come through the door. He was taller than Alcott and 5 years younger, with dark hair, cut short, and a gold watch on his left wrist that caught the light every time he moved that hand. He moved through the room with the loose, easy posture of a man who had never in his life been told to wait. He walked directly to Sylvia's table. He did not greet her the way you greet someone you see occasionally. He greeted her the way you greet someone whose absence has been costing you something. Wren set down her hot chocolate and pressed her forehead slightly closer to the glass. They sat close. They did not touch their menus. The conversation was the kind that has been going on for a long time in rooms other than this one, and Wren could see it in the way they leaned and the way their faces moved unhurried and certain of one another, like people who have the advantage of a shared secret. She read their lips for 20 minutes. Most of what they said was about timing. The word arrangements came up twice and logistics once. She caught the phrase everything in place and the phrase once it is done, and a number that she could not quite resolve from this angle, though it had a lot of zeros. And then near the end, as the check was being settled, the man reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the table. A hotel room key card. He set it there between their water glasses as matter of fact as setting down a pen. Sylvia Hargrove picked it up and slid it under her napkin and put it in her purse. She was wearing the engagement ring Dorian Alcott had given her. Wren sat back from the window and thought about what she had just seen for a long moment. Then she thought about it for another moment. She picked up her hot chocolate and finished it and set the cup down. She had come this week to watch Sylvia Hargrove in order to plan around her. She had expected to find a woman in love with a powerful man and to plan accordingly. She had not expected to find a woman who was not in love with him at all. She had not expected to find someone who intended to bury him. That changed things. Or more precisely, it changed the order of things. Wren walked back to the tunnel that evening and sat in her corner and thought it through the way she thought everything through, methodically and without rushing, because she had learned that rushing was what got people caught, and caught was the only thing she could not afford. She pulled the folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of her coat and smoothed it against her knee. Do not forget. Alcott. The handwriting she knew better than her own. The original plan was direct. Get close enough. Make it count. Disappear back into the city that had been hiding her for 3 years. She had rehearsed it until it had the texture of a memory rather than a plan. It was the most important thing she had ever prepared for, and she had prepared for it the way a soldier prepares, without sentiment and without illusion. But if Sylvia was planning to kill Alcott before Wren could, she would never know. She would never stand close enough to look him in the eye. She would never find out whether the man who had ordered her mother's death had known what he was ordering, or whether he was something more complicated than the monster she had spent 3 years building in her head. She needed to know, not for mercy. She was clear on that even at 9 years old, with a clarity that had been earned rather than inherited. She needed to know the way a mathematician needs to prove a theorem before acting on it. You do not build your whole life on an assumption, you verify first. So she would have to warn him. Not because she cared whether he lived. She cared whether she had the right answer before she made the last move of the only game she had ever played. If Sylvia's poison or Sylvia's plan got to him first, the question would never be answered. The theorem would never be proved. And a life spent toward a single purpose would end without the one thing that purpose required. She would warn him, she would get close enough to see him, and then she would watch. She folded the paper back into her pocket and picked up the whetstone and the knife, and in the cold dark beneath the city, she began to plan. She found his car on a Monday morning. She had spent the weekend mapping his movements from a distance, and she had identified the route from the Alcott residence on the Upper East Side to the construction office in Red Hook that he visited every Monday at 9. There were 2 points where the traffic consistently tightened into something close to a stop. One was at Canal and Delancey. One was at the base of the bridge approach. The approach was wrong. Too many sight lines. Too many people moving in too many directions. Canal and Delancey was better. There was a delivery corridor on the northwest corner that funneled foot traffic into a narrow stream, which gave her natural cover to approach the vehicle from the passenger side. The traffic light at that intersection had a timing pattern she had clocked twice over the weekend, 42 seconds of red under normal conditions, sometimes longer, when a delivery truck blocked the flow. 42 seconds was enough. She positioned herself in the delivery corridor at 7:45 in the morning and waited. She had her coat buttoned to the collar and her sneakers, the ones whose laces she had knotted after they snapped, rather than replacing them because she did not have the $1.50 to replace them, and had decided that a knot held just as well. Her hair was the color of wet earth and had not seen a comb in several days. She looked like what she was, which was exactly what she wanted. The black Escalade came through the intersection at 8:12. The light caught it at Canal and Delancey. The delivery truck ahead of it had moved halfway into the intersection and stopped, and the Escalade pulled to a hard halt behind a yellow cab. The traffic on Bowery was not moving. Wren stepped out of the delivery corridor and crossed to the narrow strip of slush between the Escalade and the cab ahead of it. She walked slowly down the length of the car, trailing her fingers along the black paint. She had read once in an article about security that the way to destabilize a trained bodyguard was to behave in a way that did not fit any category. Not threatening, not fleeing, just wrong. She moved at the pace of a person who had all day with her fingers touching the car the way you touch something you are trying to understand. The window was down 2 inches by the time she reached the rear passenger door. She stopped. She did not beg. She did not press her face to the glass. She raised one fist and knocked 3 times cleanly and without urgency. She looked through the gap at the man inside. Dorian Alcott was exactly the face she had memorized. The scar along the jaw faded to old paper. The eyes pale and cold, and currently pointed directly at her with the focused stillness of a man who had trained himself not to react to things until he understood them. He was more tired than the photograph suggested. There were lines around the eyes that only appeared on men who had been making hard decisions for too long. And there was something behind the cold that the photographs had not captured. Something that was calculating the situation she represented with the speed and precision of a man accustomed to calculating everything. She spoke quickly and quietly, close to the gap her voice meant only for him. If you marry that woman, you will not be alive on the second morning at the wedding. I am not lying to you. A car behind them laid on its horn. The delivery truck had moved. She heard the partition inside the vehicle snap up and felt the Escalade accelerate forward before she had taken a step back. She stood in the intersection as the car pulled through and watched it go. She did not run. She walked back to the delivery corridor at the same pace she had come, slipped around the corner, and was in the flow of the morning crowd before the light had changed again. She did not look back. She walked 12 blocks before she let herself stop. She stood in a doorway on Grand Street and pressed her back against the cold brick and thought about his eyes through that 2-inch gap of bulletproof glass. They had not been afraid of her. They had been measuring her. There was a difference, and she had learned to feel it. He would find her. She had given him enough to need more. She had not given him enough to dismiss. That was the calculation, and the calculation had to be right because the next move depended entirely on him coming to her rather than her going to him. She began walking north toward the library. She had a name to verify and a timetable to understand and a story to assemble from the parts she had gathered, and she intended to have it ready before he arrived. She chose her spot deliberately. The third landing from the top of the 42nd Street exit staircase at Grand Central, in the corner where the stone wall met the stair rail. She had slept here on enough nights to know the geometry of the light and the sound and the movement of people through this space. The late evening crowd thinned to a trickle. By 9 and by 10, the staircase belonged mostly to the marble and the green ceiling glow, and the thin black cat who lived somewhere in the station's lower levels and came to her for the pieces of sesame bagel she kept in her coat pocket. She did not know if Alcott would find her in 1 day or 3 or 7. She had left no trail beyond the scene at the intersection. She had given him no name. She had given him only her face and her words and the memory of her fingers on his car door. It would take a man of his resources a certain amount of time to pull that thread far enough to find the other end. He found her on the second day. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of city shoes on marble steps, a deliberate and unhurried climb, and then the stop. He stood 3 steps below her. She did not look up. She broke another piece of bagel and held it toward the cat, who accepted it with the composed dignity of an animal that had never in its life needed to be grateful. He climbed the last 3 steps and lowered himself onto the stone beside her. He did not speak. She did not speak. The black cat chewed slowly and watched the stranger with the wise, patient attention of an animal that had seen worse. A full minute passed. "You took 2 days," she said finally. She did not turn her head. "I thought a man like you would be faster." She felt him look at her. He was trying to understand what she was the way you try to understand something that has placed itself outside every category you have ever used. She could feel it the way she felt weather as a change in the quality of the air around a person. "You were waiting for me," he said. "I was waiting to see how long it took." 2 days is not bad for someone who never looks at the people under his feet. His voice, when it came back, was careful. Not insulted, just careful. "Tell me what you saw." So she told him. The restaurant on the Upper East Side, the window seat in the clear sight line, the man with the gold watch, the hotel key card set between 2 water glasses, matter of fact as a tip, the engagement ring on Sylvia's hand when she slid the card into her purse, the 20 minutes of conversation she had read from the outside of the glass. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than silence usually lasted between 2 people. "She does not love me," he said. It was not a question. "She is not here for love," Wren said. "She is here for whatever comes after you are gone." Another silence. The cat walked across the stone between them and settled on his other side, which surprised Wren slightly, because the cat was usually specific about its preferences. "Come with me," he said. "I have a place where you will be safe. No one will touch you. In return, you tell me everything you know. When it is finished, you decide what comes next. School, a real bed, a way out. I give you my word." Wren looked at the cat. She looked at her cracked hands. She looked at the pocket where the knife was warm from her body heat. She thought about his face in the photographs, in his face through 2 inches of bulletproof glass, and the particular look in his eyes just now, which was the look of a man who had begun pulling at a thread and already felt the structure behind it start to shift. She had 20 questions that this answer did not cover. She had a plan that this offer complicated enormously. She had a promise made to a ghost in a tunnel 3 years and 2 months ago that she had not yet kept and was not ready to release. She let her face do what a cold and hungry 9-year-old's face was supposed to do when a grown man offered shelter. She let the uncertainty and the caution show, and the slow, reluctant softening that would look to him like hope. Inside her head, she was colder than the stone under her. "Okay," she said, "I will come." He nodded once and stood. The black cat watched him with his tail wrapped around its paws, and in the green light of the great hall below, it looked like a witness who had been sitting there long enough to have seen everything twice. They walked down the marble stairs together, the man who had not yet been killed and the child who had not yet decided whether to kill him, and the city absorbed them both without a change in its expression, because that is what cities do with the things they do not understand. The safe house was not the mansion on 72nd Street. Ren registered this immediately when the car did not go north. The driver, a man built like a piece of furniture, turned west into Soho without being told, which meant Alcott had made this decision before the car arrived, which meant he had thought through the exposure and decided against it. Good, she thought. He was careful. Careful men were harder. But she had not come this far by planning against easy ones. The building was old cast iron, the kind that had been warehouses in a previous century and had been renovated since into something expensive, while keeping just enough of the original iron and brick to suggest continuity. The apartment was at the top. A woman named Donatella, silver-haired and compact and entirely incurious, met them at the door. She had a pot of something on the stove. She had prepared a bedroom with new clothes folded in two neat stacks on the comforter. She set a plate of food on a small table by the window without being asked and withdrew without explanation. Ren ate all of it. She ate it too fast, and she knew Alcott was watching, and she did not care, because her body was 9 years old, and it had not had warm food in 8 days, and there are limits to what planning can override. When the plate was empty and Donatella had cleared it, Alcott paused in the doorway of the room. "The lock works from the inside," he said. "No one opens it without your voice saying to come in. If you need me, press 0 on the phone by the bed." She nodded. He waited half a beat as though there was something else he meant to say. Then he did not say it, and he pulled the door shut. She turned the lock. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. The comforter was white and thick and smelled of lavender. The mattress was real. The bedside lamp made a warm circle on the wood of the small table. Every soft thing in the room seemed like something that wanted to make her lower her guard, and she looked at each of them with the same mild suspicion she applied to everything that seemed to want something from her. She took the comforter off the bed and folded it into a long, narrow rectangle and carried it to the space beneath the window. The floor was wide oak planks cold through the fabric. From that position, she could see the edge of the fire escape through the glass and 3 potential routes to the alley below, and anyone who might try the bedroom door from the hallway. She reached under the edge of the pillow she had pulled down with her and placed the knife there. It was there, warm from her coat, then warm from her hand. She closed her fingers around the handle for a moment. Dorian Alcott was 2 rooms away in this building. She had been within 40 feet of him for the past 40 minutes. She had been within arm's reach of him on the staircase at Grand Central for 11 minutes. She had been within striking distance at least 3 times, and each time her hand had moved toward the pocket and stopped because the question had not yet been answered, and the question had to come first. That was the agreement she had made with herself 3 years ago on a tunnel floor in the dark, and she had not broken it yet. She unclenched her hand from the knife handle. She laid her palm flat on the floor instead and felt the building's cold and its weight beneath her. She was inside the walls now. She had access she had never had before. She would watch him the way she had watched every surface of this city for 3 years, from just below the level that people looked. She would find the answer, and when she had it, she would know what to do. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 3 years and 2 months, in a warm building with a locked door and a knife within reach, Ren Calloway slept for more than 2 hours without waking. In the morning, that was the thing she hated most about the night before. The morning after her first real sleep in 3 years, Ren woke before the light changed and lay still for 60 seconds, with her hand on the knife beneath the pillow she had dragged to the floor. Old habit. You did not move until you had listened to the building and understood it. She listened now. The radiator ticked in a slow, irregular rhythm. Somewhere farther into the apartment, a coffee machine ran through its cycle. Below on Green Street, the first delivery trucks were moving. The building was what it had been the night before. Nobody had tried the door. She stood up, folded the comforter back into its rectangle, and placed it at the foot of the bed. She dressed in the clothes Donatella had left, which fit precisely, which told her Alcott had estimated her size without asking, which told her something about the quality of his attention. She unlocked the door and walked to the kitchen. He was already there, standing at the window with a small cup of espresso, reading messages on a phone with a case that had no brand markings. He did not look up when she came in, but he registered her arrival the way a person registers a sound they have been expecting. He gestured at the stool across the island with 2 fingers, the economical gesture of a man who had spent decades giving instructions that did not require words. Donatella was at the stove. She set a plate in front of Ren without being asked. Eggs, toast, half a sliced orange. Ren ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that food was a resource, and resources were not to be wasted on ceremony. Alcott set his phone down and looked at her. "I need your eyes," he said, "not your knife, not your courage. Your eyes. You go where adults cannot go without being seen. You listen to what gets said when the room thinks it is empty. You watch Sylvia at 3 events this week, and you tell me what does not fit. That is the whole job." He slid a prepaid phone across the marble toward her. "One number saved," he said. "Mine. If a face repeats, if a room changes temperature, if anything at all tells you to leave, you press that number and you walk to the nearest public exit. You do not run. You walk." She picked up the phone. It was warm. He had been carrying it. "And when it is over," she said, "when it is over, whatever you decide about your life, you will have the means to decide it. That is my word." She looked at him across the kitchen island and thought about the word "my" and what it weighed coming from a man like this. She thought about the knife in the inner pocket of her coat, which she had transferred there from the pillow before she left the room, and she thought about the fact that she was sitting in his kitchen, eating his eggs, and that none of this was what she had planned, and all of it was exactly where she needed to be. "Okay," she said. He nodded once. Donatella refilled her orange juice without comment. The morning continued. The first 2 events were unremarkable in the way that useful observations are always unremarkable on the surface. Wren watched Sylvia Hargrove at a charity luncheon at a hotel on Park Avenue South from a seat in the lobby where she appeared to be waiting for someone who was running late, which was a position she had found reliable, because people waiting in lobbies were invisible, the same way potted plants were invisible. She watched Sylvia move through a room of women in expensive clothes with the ease of a person who had done this in many rooms, in many cities, and she noted the specific way that ease was constructed. Not natural, practiced. The laugh that arrived at exactly the right volume. The hand on the arm of the right person at the right moment. The listening face deployed like a tool. The second event was a board meeting for a foundation that did something with literacy in public schools. Wren sat on a bench outside the building with a library book and watched Sylvia go in and come out. What she noted was that Sylvia came out 17 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to end and made a phone call on a personal cell phone while walking toward the corner, not the phone she had used inside. She stood at the corner for 4 minutes, listened more than she spoke, and put the second phone back in an interior pocket of her coat before rejoining her driver. 2 phones, that was worth knowing. The third event was a gallery opening on West 24th Street on a Friday evening. This was the one that changed everything. Sylvia was scheduled to arrive at 7. At 6:55, a black Bentley pulled up and a woman in a cream cashmere coat stepped out. Same height as Sylvia, same handbag, same signature tilt of the chin when she turned to speak to the driver. But the shoes were wrong. Sylvia Hargrove wore one brand for daytime events exclusively, and Wren had confirmed this across 5 separate observations over 2 weeks. The woman stepping out of the Bentley was wearing a different brand entirely. The walk was close, but the weight distribution was off. Someone had studied Sylvia's posture and practiced it, but had not gotten down to the level of the feet where habit lives. A decoy. Wren dropped the cup she was holding into the nearest trash can and moved. She crossed the avenue behind a delivery truck and tracked the Bentley with her eyes as it pulled away empty. Then she turned south because the only reason to send a decoy to the visible event was to free yourself for the one you did not want witnessed. It took her 2 hours, 4 subway stops, and 1 moment of luck in the form of a crumpled cab receipt face up on a wet corner of Bleecker Street. The address on the receipt was 1 block east. She walked it slowly, reading the storefronts, until she found the one that matched the kind of place a person would choose for a conversation they needed the city to lose. It was a bar called the Crestwood Lounge, tucked between a cobbler and a florist in a narrow slot of a building, with a sign so small and so deliberate in its smallness that you had to already know it was there to find it. She circled the block once to map her exits. Then she found the service entrance beside the florist, where a delivery man was unloading boxes of tonic water, and she carried 2 of them inside with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who belonged there, and the delivery man did not look at her face once. That was the whole secret of invisibility. 3 seconds of usefulness in exchange for 3 hours of not being seen. The back of the bar was dark wood and green velvet and low brass lamps, and it smelled of bourbon and decades. A man with a waxed mustache was polishing a glass behind the bar and paying attention to nothing. Wren crossed to the far end, climbed onto a stool in the shadow of a tall cabinet, and pulled the library book she had been carrying all day from her coat pocket. A child reading at the corner of a mostly empty bar was a prop, not a threat. Sylvia was two stools around the curve, her back to Wren, her profile toward the door. She was different here in a way that Wren immediately cataloged and filed. No performance, no practiced ease. She was in jeans and a plain dark sweater and flat boots, her hair pulled back without ornament, and she looked for the first time like a person rather than a projection of one. She looked younger. She looked in the low amber light like someone who had been playing a role for so long that the moment of setting it down registered on her face as physical relief. The door opened at 7:23 and the man came in. Wren recognized him before he reached the table. The dark hair cut close, the gold watch on the left wrist catching the lamplight with each step. He moved through the room with the particular ease of a man who had never once in his life been told to wait for something he wanted. He went straight to Sylvia and she stood, and his arms came around her waist and hers around his neck. And it was not a greeting. It was a resumption, the continuation of something that existed in the time between their meetings and did not require them to build it from scratch each time they were in the same room. Corbin Hargrove. Wren did not know his name yet, but she recognized the dynamic immediately. Not a lover in the ordinary sense. Something older than that, something built on shared purpose rather than shared feeling, though there was feeling too overlaid on top of the purpose like a second coat of paint. She pressed the record button on the prepaid phone inside her coat pocket without removing the phone from the pocket. She turned a page of the book. She let her ears do their work. Their voices were low, but the velvet walls of the Crestwood Lounge turned whispers into kept things, and a child's hearing was sharper than a grown man's, and she had spent 3 years training herself to separate signal from noise in environments far louder than this one. She caught it in pieces, not all at once, but in the sequence of a conversation that had been having the same structure for a long time and was now approaching a conclusion. The wine, a specific vintage 1985 Barolo, sealed before transport, introduced through the cork using specialized equipment that left no visible trace. She caught the word villa in the phrase second night, and she caught the name of a lake. She caught the number 6 months spoken in the tone of a man setting a deadline that was also a promise. She caught the phrase 200 million with the same flat affect you would use to describe a commute, as though the number were a fact about weather rather than the reason for everything. And then near the end, when the bartender had brought 2 small glasses of something amber without being asked, and the conversation had moved from logistics to something that sounded almost like affection, she caught a name she had not heard before. We have Tillman inside the executive tier. The man said it quietly with the satisfaction of someone reporting a piece of engineering that had come together correctly. He had someone inside the structure that Alcott had built and had reason to believe was loyal. A man named Tillman at a level where accounts could be moved and lawyers could be delayed, and the machinery that held an empire together could be gently, invisibly bent. Wren turned another page of the book. 2 minutes later, she set the book under her arm and slid off the stool and walked past them. At the distance, a child walks past, strangers who are not her concern. Sylvia's eyes moved to her for half a second, found nothing worth noting, and returned. Wren walked through the front door of the Crestwood Lounge and out into the West Village evening and kept walking for 4 blocks before she stopped. She stood in the mouth of an empty alley with her back to the brick and breathed. Not from fear, from the particular effort of keeping your face and body entirely quiet while your mind was running at full speed. She had been doing that for 40 minutes, and the cost of it landed now all at once in her shoulders and her jaw. The plan was more deliberate than she had expected. The poisoned wine, the scheduled phone call, the specific timeline. Alcott had been right to doubt something. He had been wrong about the scale of it. This was not a woman who had decided on a feeling to betray a man she had chosen poorly. This was a structure. It had architecture. It had a man on the inside named Tillman, positioned and patient, and it had been running long before Sylvia Hargrove had ever appeared at a charity event on the Upper East Side with a smile calibrated to make a careful man lower his guard. She pressed the 0 on the prepaid phone. He answered before the second ring. "I have something," she said. "Not on the phone." He was quiet for 2 seconds. "The car will be at the corner of Bleecker and West 10th in 8 minutes. She was there in 6. She played the recording in the library of the Soho apartment with the phone on the desk between them and Alcott seated across from her in the leather chair that faced the cold fireplace. Edmund Cray, the consigliere, stood behind and to the left of Alcott, which was apparently where he stood when something was being said that required a witness. Alcott listened without moving. His hands were folded on the arms of the chair. His face was entirely still in the way that faces were entirely still when the person behind them was doing all their work somewhere else. The recording was 90 seconds of ambient noise and partial sentences and 2 clear minutes at the end where the bar had gone quiet enough to let the voices carry. When it ended, he said, "Play it again," and she played it again. On the second pass, Edmund Cray's eyes closed for 3 seconds at the word Tillman, and when they opened, they were a different temperature than they had been before. When the recording finished the second time, Alcott pressed the intercom button on the desk and said, "Edmund." The older man was already moving toward the door of the study. Wren understood without being told that she was supposed to stay. She sat across from the empty chair and listened to the building. She could hear the low exchange of the two men in the study next door. Not the words, but the shape of the conversation, the back and forth of a very old working relationship, processing something unexpected. She heard a drawer open. She heard the particular silence that follows a decision. She was sitting in the same position when Alcott came back 12 minutes later. He settled into the chair and looked at her with an expression that was neither surprised nor grateful, but something more precise than either. The expression of a man who was reassessing the weight of something he had thought he understood. "Ward Tillman," he said. "You know him. 44 years old. He handles accounts at the executive level. He has been with his family for 9 years. His mother eats at the same restaurant every Sunday, and his dry cleaner is on Hester Street, and I have until this moment trusted him with the numbers that run the East Side operation." A silence. "Edmund is confirming the account trails now," he continued. "When he has them, we will know the architecture. But we will not move on Tillman. Not a word, not a look, not a hand. He is the wire. The wire stays live until we know everything on the other end of it." Wren nodded once. That was correct. She had already understood it before he said it. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. "How did you get inside?" he said. She told him about the delivery man and the tonic water and the 3 seconds of usefulness. He listened without expression. Then he said, and she heard the word land differently than she expected, "Good. Not thank you. Not remarkable for a child. Just good the way you say good to someone whose competence you have assessed and found sufficient." She had not been spoken to that way before by any adult who was not Garrett, and she felt the words settle somewhere in her chest in a place she did not look at directly. The 7 days that followed were the most disorienting of Wren Calloway's life, which was a life that had already contained a considerable amount of disruption. Alcott did not send her out again after the Crestwood Lounge. Edmund and 3 surveillance men took over the external work, which Wren understood was partly because the wedding was now 10 days away, and Sylvia's alertness would be tightening, and partly because Alcott had made a calculation about the acceptable risk to someone who was 9 years old and who had now become the only living witness to a conversation that could put 2 people in federal custody, which left Wren inside the apartment, which meant she watched him. She was very good at watching. She had been practicing it for 3 years in spaces where being noticed was dangerous, and she had developed the ability to occupy a doorway or a hallway corner or a kitchen stool with the quality of something that belonged to the architecture. She sat in the entrance of the rooms with the library book open on her knees, and she observed the way Dorian Alcott moved through the hours of his days. He rose at 6 without an alarm. He read his messages standing at the kitchen window, which faced east, and the morning light came through the old glass in that particular way, of old glass slightly warped and slightly golden, and he stood in it every morning for approximately 8 minutes with the small espresso cup and the 3 phones and the expression of a man who had gotten used to the view from a high place and could no longer remember what the ground looked like. He said good morning to Donatella every day, not as acknowledgement, as genuine greeting. He said it the way you say it to someone whose presence you are glad of, and Donatella answered with a small inclination of her head that had the weight of decades behind it. On the Tuesday of that week, a young man named Devlin was brought up from the lobby in a good suit with a thin film of perspiration visible above his collar. Alcott met him in the study, the door not quite closing behind them. Wren, crossing the hallway at the correct angle, heard every word without trying. "The corner on Nostrand," Devlin said. "They were already buying from someone else. I just thought if we did not cover it." You sold to teenagers, Alcott said. It was not the volume of the sentence that made it what it was. It was the register. Flat and certain, and containing within it the specific weight of a man who had said the same category of sentence many times and had never once reconsidered the verdict after delivering it. You will be in Tampa by Thursday. Your uncle has a construction outfit. You will work for him. If I see you in this city again, I will not see you twice. A pause, Devlin's voice rough and young. My wife. My boy. Longer pause. And then at a different register, something that was not soft exactly but was adjacent to it. Your wife and your son will receive your full salary every month until the boy is 18. From my account, not the family's. That is between me and them. It is not a gift to you. Do you understand the difference? Wren stepped back from the door before Devlin came out. She stood in the hallway and looked at the wall and turned that over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what was underneath it. On the Wednesday, they went to a bakery on Grand Street, which was not an errand Wren had expected to be included in, but which she was included in by the simple method of Alcott putting on his coat, looking at her in the hall and saying, "Bring a scarf." The bakery belonged to an old man whose family had leased the storefront from the Alcott family since the year Alcott's grandfather had arrived in this country, and the Albanians on the block to the east had been suggesting with the polite menace of people who understood suggestion as a form of threat that the arrangement might benefit from reconsideration. Alcott sat at a back table for 20 minutes with two men Wren could see only from behind. He spoke in a tone that never once exceeded the level of ordinary conversation. He drank the coffee that was brought to him without asking for it. He left. By the following morning, the Albanians were on a flight to Atlanta. No weapons had been drawn, no voices had been raised. Wren sat in the front of the bakery with a pastry she had been given over her protests and thought about the economy of force, about how much more expensive it was to make a demonstration than to simply be a demonstration, and about the fact that a man who understood that distinction had chosen to apply it in defense of an old man who sold bread. On the Thursday, a man called Paulie was brought up from the garage with his hands zip-tied and his eyes on the carpet. He had taken money from a cash collection in Red Hook over several months. Edmund wanted consequences that matched the tradition of the family. Wren watched from the landing above the living room with her hands on the railing and prepared herself for what she had heard in 3 years of living among people who talked about men like Alcott, that men like Alcott always did. She did not prepare herself correctly. Alcott looked at the man on his knees for a moment. Then why one word? Not as preamble, as a genuine question. And Paulie, shaking on the carpet, told him his wife, stage 3, a clinical trial at Sloan Kettering, that the insurance had refused to cover a sum of money he had not had, and had panicked and had promised himself he would put back. Alcott turned to Edmund. "Call Sloan Kettering in the morning," he said. "The full cost of the trial comes from the house account. Paulie is on administrative leave without pay until she is in remission." Nobody asks him about this. Nobody looks at him sideways. Edmund began to say something. Alcott raised one finger. Edmund closed his mouth. "Paulie," Alcott said, "listen to me. You do not steal from me again. If you need something, you come to this door and you ask. The door will open. The next time it will not." "Do we understand each other?" Paulie could not speak. He nodded until Edmund guided him out by the elbow. Wren sat down on the top step because her legs had decided, apparently on their own, that they were no longer interested in supporting her full weight. She sat there for a long time after the sound of the elevator had gone, with her hand on the railing and the particular weight of a plan she had carried for 3 years pressing down on her from the inside. She had built a monster in the dark of a tunnel for 1,095 days. She had built it carefully from the material that was available to her, which was the photograph in a newspaper and a name on a piece of paper, and the sound of 3 flat shots in an apartment hallway in Queens when she was 6 years old. She had built it to last because she needed it to last. She needed the thing she was moving toward to be simple and clear and without complication. But the monster kept doing things that monsters were not supposed to do. And Wren Calloway was honest enough in the particular way that children who have survived alone, that are honest, which was without sentimentality or self-deception, to register the problem this created. She had not yet answered the question. She was not yet certain. And until she was certain, the knife stayed in the pocket. She got up from the step and went back to her room and sat on the floor under the window and thought for a long time. On the Thursday evening, Alcott knocked on the frame of her open door. She looked up from the book. He was holding 2 things, a pair of winter boots fur-lined in leather, and a small velvet box. He set the boots at the edge of the door first. "Your size," he said. "The floors are cold." She looked at them. They were exactly her size. He had noticed without asking, which was the same thing he had done with her clothes on the first night, and she filed it in the same place she had filed that. He held out the velvet box. She crossed the room and opened it. Inside, on a bed of black satin, was a thin silver chain with a small pendant shaped like a capital letter. She said, He said, "Because I think every child ought to have something of her own to hold." She took the box in hands that had decided apparently on their own to shake. Not from fear, from something that did not have a name yet in her vocabulary. The pendant was no larger than a thumbnail. It caught the doorway light in a way that was very simple and very precise. She thought with a clarity she had not asked for that if she carried out what she had come to New York to do, this small piece of silver would be the last kind thing any person in this world had ever given her. After it, there would be nothing kind left because there would be no one left to be kind to her. Because the only person in this enormous city who had looked at her long enough to notice she was cold or hungry or 9 years old would be on the floor of the room down the hall. She closed her fingers around the pendant. "Thank you," she said in a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own. He nodded once and walked back down the hall to his study and left her standing in the doorway of her room. She sat on the floor. She placed the velvet box on her left knee. She reached under the folded comforter and found the knife and placed it on her right knee. She looked at one and then the other for a long time. The knife had weighed the same for 3 years. Tonight it was heavier. She put the pendant on. She placed the knife in the inner pocket of her coat where it had always lived. She pulled on the new boots and laced them carefully. She lay down on the floor under the window and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time. 3 days before the wedding, Corbin Hargrove made a phone call. Ward Tillman had noticed the same gray sedan 3 times in 5 days. Different plates each time, but the same scratch on the rear bumper, which was the kind of detail that accountants noticed, because accountants were people who had trained themselves to record the things that did not match. He bought a burner at a bodega on Hester Street and dialed a number he had memorized from a meeting he had not put in any calendar. "It is the child," he said. "A street kid, 9 years old, maybe 10. Alcott is keeping her in one of the Soho properties. She is the leak. Nothing has come from the phones. It is her." Corbin Hargrove's silence on the other end of the call was the specific silence of a man doing a calculation. "My sister has 7 months invested in this," he said finally. "A 9-year-old will not be the thing that ends it. I will take care of the child. You finish the power of attorney and you be inside that chapel on Saturday." The call ended. Wren knew none of this. What she knew was that Donatella had run out of dark chocolate and that the Italian coffee shop 2 blocks down Green Street made a good cup, and that she had been permitted for 4 days to walk those 2 blocks unaccompanied, and the cold had come back overnight and she wanted something hot. She left the apartment at 10:15 wearing the fur-lined boots and the silver chain under her sweater. The prepaid phone was in her right mitten. She did not see the van. It was parked on the north side of the block in the loading zone that serviced the building 2 doors down from the coffee shop. She had walked past it twice before. She had no reason to register it differently today than she had registered it yesterday. She was 2 steps from the entrance to the coffee shop when she passed the mouth of the service alley beside it. 2 men stepped out from behind a catering dolly. She had 3 seconds, and she used 2 of them correctly. She dropped her weight and turned her shoulders to reduce the contact point and got one hand to her coat pocket before a gloved hand closed over her face and she was lifted from the ground. The cloth came down over her nose with a smell that was chemical and sweet and moved through her head like a tide coming in. The prepaid phone was pulled from her hand. The sound of it being crushed under a heel was the last thing she heard clearly. She woke to cold concrete against her cheek and the taste of copper. Her wrists were bound behind her back with a zip tie that had been applied by someone who knew how to apply them. Her ankles were tied to the legs of a metal chair. Her left boot had been removed. The room was a shell of a warehouse, high grimy windows, the silence of a space that had not been used in a long time and was not near anything that cared. Corbin Hargrove was sitting across from her in a folding chair. She recognized him before he introduced himself. She had been 2 stools away from him in the Crestwood Lounge for 40 minutes. The gold watch, the close-cut hair. He was older than he had seemed in the low light of the bar, and harder in the ease she had noted then was still present, but with a different quality. Now the ease of a man who had done this specific category of thing before and found it neither difficult nor interesting. "Tell me what you know," he said. "Tell me what Alcott knows. Tell me how you found us. Do that and I make this easy." She looked at him without speaking. He was not, she thought, accustomed to silence from a 9-year-old. Most adults were not. It unsettled them in a way that other resistance did not because they had no framework for it. A child who did not flinch and did not beg occupied a category that most people had never needed to think about. He leaned forward. He drew a knife from his jacket and opened it with a quiet double click. She noted the blade length, his handle type, the angle at which he held it, which was the angle of someone who had handled knives but had not been specifically trained in them. Garrett would have had several observations about his grip. "Talk to me, little girl." She said nothing. He came closer. She could smell his aftershave, expensive and too sweet. He bent toward her, and she waited until his face was at the correct distance, and she gathered what was in her mouth, and she spat. Red hit him across the cheek. He straightened slowly. He wiped his face with the back of his free hand. He looked at the blood on his hand with an expression that was almost, she thought, admiring. "The hard way, then," he said, and his voice had changed in a way she registered and did not allow herself to respond to. She pressed her feet flat against the floor through the zip ties and squared her shoulders and looked at Corbin Hargrove across 4 feet of cold concrete, and she waited. Across the city in the Soho apartment, Donatella set an extra cup of hot chocolate on the kitchen island and looked at the clock. The child had been gone for 47 minutes. The coffee shop was 6 minutes from the front door. Donatella had been cooking for this family since Alcott's father was alive, and she had never once in all those years allowed herself an opinion about the things that happened in the rooms of these apartments. But she had opinions about children. She walked to the study door and knocked once. "She is not back," she said. Alcott looked up from the desk. Donatella watched his face do something she had seen it do only twice before in the 30 years she had known it. It did the thing it did when something mattered enough to show. He was on the phone before she had finished closing the door. The pendant had been more than a gift. Not the only thing Alcott had done in the days since Edmund had set the folder on his desk, but the most specific. He had commissioned it from a jeweler on Elizabeth Street who owed the family a favor, who had soldered the 2 faces of the small silver W together around a GPS chip the size of a grain of rice, who had delivered it to the apartment and had asked no questions about why a man with a $200 million operation needed to know the precise location of a child who wore a coat 3 sizes too large. The dot was motionless on Walnut Avenue in the South Bronx. It had not moved in 51 minutes. 8 men were in cars within 9 minutes. Alcott was in the first one with Vincent, who had been with the family for 11 years and who was the quietest and most competent person on Alcott's payroll, and Tony, who had been with the family for 20 years and who handled the vehicle through the FDR and across the 3rd Avenue Bridge with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that speed and control were not the same thing. The roll-down gate went up under a hydraulic spreader in 18 seconds. There were 4 men inside. 3 hands went to holsters. 3 hands were too slow. Alcott moved through the secondary door at the back of the warehouse with Vincent at his shoulder. He pushed through a sheet metal door on the far wall. She was in a metal chair with her wrists tied behind her and 1 boot missing and her lower lip split. The bruise along her jaw was beginning to rise in the particular purple of a recent impact. Her head was up. Her shoulders were square. She was looking at the doorway with the patient, measuring expression he had first seen through 2 inches of bulletproof glass at a red light on Delancey Street, the expression of a person taking the full account of who had arrived before deciding what to do with the information. When she saw it was him, something shifted in her eyes. It was not relief. It was not gratitude. It was something older and more careful than either of those. It was the look of someone who had just received a piece of information they had not permitted themselves to hope for and were not yet certain what to do with. He holstered the weapon. He took the folding knife from his inside pocket and cut the zip ties from her wrists first, then from her ankles, and when the last one parted, she leaned forward out of the chair and into the front of his coat. He put his arms around her. She was slight in the way that people who have lived on insufficient food for a long time were slight, all angles and concentrated solidity, nothing wasted. He held her carefully. Corbin Hargrove was on the concrete floor with a round through the meat of his right shoulder, breathing steadily, staring at the ceiling with the resigned expression of a man recalculating outcomes. Alive, Alcott said to the room. He is for the federal authorities. Keep him that way. He carried Wren through the warehouse and out through the rolled gate and into the cold night air of the South Bronx. He laid her across the back seat of the Escalade and got in beside her, and the car moved south toward Manhattan without being told. Somewhere past the Third Avenue Bridge, her voice came up from the seat beside him, small and even, and positioned in the dark like a word placed carefully on a surface it was not sure would hold it. You know now, she said, do you not? He closed his eyes. He nodded once against the top of her head. He did not speak. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He had learned in 38 years of living in a world where words were frequently used as instruments rather than communications, the precise difference between a thing that needed to be said and a thing that needed only to be true. This was the second kind, and there was no word in any language he had ever been taught that was going to be sufficient for what he had done to June Calloway, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and somewhere in the space between those two knowings, the car crossed back onto the island of Manhattan, and the city came up around them again in all its indifferent and glittering continuity. Wren closed her eyes. The pendant was still around her neck, warm from her skin. The knife was still in her coat pocket, warm from her body. She had the answer now, or most of it, enough of it to know that what she had been building for 3 years in the dark was not a false structure, but an incomplete one, and that the part she had been missing was not going to make what she still had to do easier. It was going to make it the hardest thing she had ever done. By the time the Escalade reached us, she was asleep. The family doctor came at 10 to 9. His name was Abernathy, and he had been the Alcott family physician for longer than Dorian had been the head of it, which meant he had stitched and set and quietly documented injuries that had never appeared in any hospital record in the city of New York. He arrived with a black bag and no questions, and he worked with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had made his peace long ago with the particular nature of his practice. He cleaned the split lip. He pressed carefully along her ribs, watching her face for the involuntary responses that told the truth regardless of what the patient said, and found nothing broken. He checked her pupils. He taped the corner of her lip with 2 butterfly stitches and gave her 2 small tablets for the pain and told her to drink water. Alcott sat in the chair by the window throughout the examination and did not speak. When Abernathy had packed his bag and let himself out, Alcott crossed to the bed where Wren was sitting against the headboard with her knees pulled up and her hands around a glass of water. He laid the back of his fingers against her forehead for 1 second. He pulled the comforter up to her shoulder. He turned off the lamp. Sleep, he said. He left the door open 2 inches as he always did, as he had done every night since she arrived. Wren listened to his footsteps move down the hall. She listened to the study door close. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let the pain medication begin its slow work on the bruise along her jaw and the split at the corner of her lip. She did not sleep for a long time. Outside, the city did what it always did, which was continue. In the morning, Alcott called the FBI. He told Wren at breakfast, not because he owed her the information, but because she had earned it, and because he had understood in the last 10 days that she was not a child in the ordinary sense of someone who was shielded from the operations of the world by the fact of their age. She was someone who had been living in the operations of the world for 3 years without a shield of any kind, and treating her otherwise was not protection. It was condescension. He told her the name, Agent Cora Fennick. 42 years old, the Organized Crime Division, the specific tenacity of someone who had spent a decade trying to prove things she already knew were true and had learned to build cases that did not leave gaps. 4 years ago, she had been building a racketeering case against a cousin of Alcott's, who had been conducting himself in a manner that embarrassed the family. Alcott had handled the cousin by methods that Fennick's case file would never document, and had left on her desk the verified names and locations of 3 union officials she had been unable to connect to anything prosecutable for 18 months. The exchange had never been spoken. Both of them understood what it was. They had not spoken since. He was going to call her today. What do you want from her? Wren asked. Everything, he said. The brother, the woman, Tillman, the courier network in Philadelphia. Every name on every wire transfer back 7 years. Every case in every city that might be connected to what they have been doing. He paused. He set his espresso cup down on the marble. If I move on them myself, the network reorganizes around a new face within a year, he said. If Fennick moves on them with what we have, the network stops existing. He looked at the table for a moment. There are 3 dead husbands in 3 cities and a man in a hospital in Toronto who will never sit up on his own again. The people who can address that are not the people who work for me. Ren turned this over. She understood the logic. She understood also what it cost him to apply it. A man who had built his life on the principle that the institutions of the law were unreliable partners was choosing in this specific instance to rely on them. Not from faith, from precision. There is one condition, he said. He looked at her directly. Your name appears nowhere. Not as a witness, not as a source, not as a note in a margin of a field report. You do not exist in any piece of paper this generates. If it appears, the arrangement ends before it begins. That is non-negotiable. Ren looked at him across the kitchen island. Okay, she said. He nodded once. He picked up the phone. He met Fennick at a diner in Woodside, Queens, in a booth at the back that was equidistant from both exits. She had red hair and wore plain clothes and did not pretend for a moment that the meeting was anything other than what it was. She read the summary he had prepared, a single-page dense, no decoration. She read it twice. The color left her face and returned at a slightly different register. Then she asked the question Alcott had anticipated. What did he want in return? He told her. Distance from the press. No subpoena for Edmund Cray. And the name of the child who had made this possible would not appear in any document, any testimony, any record of any kind connected to this case or any case that grew from it. She did not exist. If she appeared, the arrangement dissolved. Fennick had looked at him across the booth for a long moment. What is the child's name, she asked. You will never need to know it, he said. She extended her hand across the table, which was a thing she had not done to him before in the occasions on which they had interacted, and he shook it once. He gave her the timing of Sylvia's plan. The villa the second night, the poisoned wine already delivered to the property. He told her about Ward Tillman and the power of attorney being forged at that moment in an office in Midtown by a man who believed his surveillance blind spots were larger than they were. He told her where Corbin Hargrove was currently being held, courtesy of the prior night's operation in the South Bronx, and that a federal transfer could be arranged through channels that would require minimal documentation from his side. Fennick absorbed all of it without writing anything down. See you at the ceremony, she said. The arrest is the ceremony, he replied. She was already putting on her coat. On the Thursday evening, 4 days after the warehouse and 2 days before the wedding, Alcott knocked on the frame of Ren's open door. She looked up from the book. There is something I should tell you, he said. Not in the kitchen, not in the study. He asked if she would sit in the hallway with him, which was the only room in the apartment that was not for anything in particular. She put the book down and followed him, and they sat down on the floor with their backs against the wall, the wide Persian runner between them and the pale light from the landing lamp above. He had known for 8 days, he told her, from the moment Edmund had set the photograph of June Calloway on his desk. He had not spoken before now because there was no version of the telling that could be prepared for. And because he had understood from the way she watched him from doorways and hallways with that particular quality of attention that she was still in the process of finding out something she needed to find out herself. He had waited until she had found enough of it that the rest could be given without destroying what she had built. Then he told her all of it. Ward Tillman and the Thursday night meetings at Rosario's and the pipeline to Philadelphia. The federal agent and the 2 written refusals, in the date of the last one, February 11th, and the date of the order, February 14th. Her mother had not been what the report had said she was. The report had been built from nothing by a man who had needed her gone and had used the existing machinery to accomplish it. He had signed the order on the strength of a report he had not read twice. He set it in the same register he had used weeks before at the dining room table when he had told her about the woman he carried in the back of his mouth and would not say aloud. The register of a man who had decided that there was no version of this that was comfortable and that therefore comfort was not the objective. Ren sat with her back against the wall and listened to all of it. She looked at the pattern in the runner on the floor, dark red and cream and geometric, the kind of pattern that could be followed from one end to the other or could be observed as a whole. She thought about her mother's hands, which had been steady, the hands of a woman who carried heavy trays for 10 hours at a time and never spilled anything that she was not ready to spill. She thought about the timing of it, which was the Thursday of the last week of January, which was the Thursday Tillman had met a man from Philadelphia in the back office of Rosario's, and her mother had been cleaning that office as she always did after close. Her mother had heard something, and she had been afraid, And she had not gone to anyone with what she had heard because she had a 6-year-old daughter and no safety net, and the kind of clear-eyed practical intelligence that understood the cost of certain kinds of bravery before it was asked of you. She had refused the federal agent twice, in writing, because she was trying to stay below the line, because she was trying to get through it without becoming something that required a response from the people whose business it was. She had not gotten through it. After a long time, she said she deserved better than what happened to her. Yes, he said, she did not go to them. She tried to stay out of it. I know that now, he said. What do you do with that, she said. She did not say it to him. She said it to the runner on the floor. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I do not know. I have been asking that for 3 years. What I know is that there is no answer that fits into the time I have left in the way the debt fits. The debt is larger. It will always be larger. What you do with a debt that is always larger is you do not look for a way to close it. You carry it, and you try to make sure that what you build with your hands in the time you have is worth more than the damage you caused. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the runner too. In the pale lamp light of the hallway, he looked like what he was, which was a man who had grown up in the shadow of a thing that had been there before him and had made choices in that shadow, some of them wrong in ways he could not undo, and who was still at 38 in the process of finding out what kind of person he was capable of becoming when the choices were his to make. Thank you, she said, for telling me yourself. He nodded once. They sat for a while longer. A car moved through the night outside and its headlights crossed the ceiling above them and passed. She stood up first. She went to her room. She took the coat off the hook. She reached into the inner pocket. The wood of the handle was warm, as it had always been warm from her body, from the 3 years of being carried next to the place where her pulse was loudest. She looked at it for a moment. Then she placed it on the small table by the window next to the lamp she had never turned on, and she left it there and she went to bed. But at 1:37 in the morning, she was awake. Not from a nightmare, from the kind of waking that comes when the mind has been working on something through the hours of sleep and has arrived at the edge of a thing it needs to complete before it can rest properly. She lay in the dark and knew what she was going to do before she had finished the thought, and she got up. She walked to the small table by the window. She picked up the knife. She opened it in the dark. The small double click of the blade was the only sound in the room. She walked down the hallway on bare feet. The Persian runner swallowed every step. She passed the library and the dining room and the kitchen. Her breath did not shake. His bedroom door was not locked. It had not been locked a single night since she had come to live here. She pushed it open 6 inches. The room was gray and still. The light from Green Street lay across the foot of the bed in a pale bar. Dorian Alcott was asleep on his back, one hand open on the duvet beside him. Without the suit and the 3 phones and the particular quality of alertness that his eyes carried in all her waking observations of him, he looked in the soft gray like someone she had not met yet, or like someone she had known for a long time in a different way. She stepped into the room. She stood beside the bed at the level of his shoulder. She held the knife. She looked at his face, the scar along the jaw faded to old paper, the fine lines around the eyes that only appeared on men who had been making difficult decisions for long enough that the difficulty had become physical. She stood there for a long time. The memories came, not in order: the pink rug, the soup pot on the sill, the tiramisu in the napkin, the 3 flat sounds that were nothing like the movies, the piece of paper in her mother's open hand, the 11 months in the group home, and the photograph that was taken in the first week. Garrett in the steam corridor drawing a line on his own arm to show her where the geometry of the body permitted a small blade to matter. The microfilm machines at the library on Fifth Avenue. 1,095 mornings in the dark with the whetstone and the name said quietly before she went up into the light. And then the other things. The 2 inches of bulletproof glass and the gray eyes on the other side of it that had been measuring rather than afraid. The bagel and the black cat and the 3 steps from the bottom of the Grand Central staircase. The warm phone pressed against his chest before he handed it to her. The way he had said good in the kitchen. The coat on her shoulders at the living room window. The boots in the velvet box outside her door. Devlin's salary sent to his family. Paulie's wife and the bill paid from a personal account, and the single raised finger that had silenced the tradition of the family in favor of the individual in front of him. The pendant warm at her collarbone. She had 20 chances, she had told herself, on the floor under the window on her first night in this building. She had not taken any of them. She had told herself it was because the question was not answered. The question was answered now. It had been answered for days. What she had not told herself, because it was the hardest piece and she had needed to come all the way here to see it, was that the question was not the only reason she had not taken the 20 chances. The other reason was simpler and more frightening. She had not taken them because she had already begun without deciding to not want to. A tear fell off her chin. She had not felt it form. It landed on his cheek and ran down toward the hollow below his ear, and Dorian Alcott opened his eyes. He did not startle. He did not sit up. He did not reach for anything. He looked at her face first, the split lip and the wet eyes, and then his gaze moved down to the blade in the gray light above his chest, and he looked at it with the same steadiness he had brought to every difficult thing she had seen him look at in the weeks she had spent watching him. He looked back up at her eyes. He did not call for anyone. He did not bargain. He lay there with his hands open on the duvet, and he waited. "You know," he said. His voice was no louder than the quiet of the room. "And you have the right." She tried to speak. Her throat closed around the first word. "I knew from the beginning," she said when it came. "I came here to find you. I have known your face from newspapers since I was 7 years old. I had 20 chances and I did not take a single one because I needed to be certain first. And I found the answer, and then I found something else." He did not ask what. He waited. "If I do this," she said, and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, and she let it break. "I do not just lose my mother. She was already gone, and I have known that for 3 years, and I have been living inside that the whole time. But if I do this, I lose the only person left in this world who sees me." He sat up very slowly. He did not reach for the knife. He did not reach for her. "Ren," he said. Her fingers opened. The knife fell. It hit the oak floor beside the bed with a single small, dry, definitive note, a clean sound that ran out along the boards and was gone. She looked down at it as though she were seeing it for the first time, as though the object that had been warm in her hand for 3 years had only just now become an object with weight and edges and a wooden handle worn smooth by being held. Her hand hung empty at her side. "I am not forgiving you because I am forgetting," she said. Her voice was still broken in the middle, and she did not try to repair it. "I will never forget. Every day of my life. The rug, the closet, the piece of paper in her hand. I am going to carry that the way you said you carry her name. It does not go away, and I do not want it to." He looked at her and let her see his face. He did not compose it. He let her see whatever was in it, which was considerable, and had no clean name but was visible, which was the thing that mattered. "Then why?" he said quietly. "Because she was my mother, and she deserves someone who would love her and remember her and carry her, and that person is me, and I cannot do that if I am the girl who spent her whole life doing the one thing, and then there is nothing left on the other side of it." She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. "I came here to end something, and it is ended. He is in custody. She will be. Tillman will be. The thing my mother died because of is ended. That is enough. That is what I came here to do." He was very still. "The rest of it," she said, looking at him through the gray light, "the rest of it I want to figure out. What comes next? What a normal thing looks like." She stopped again. "I have never had a normal thing." He opened his arms. He did not move toward her. He sat on the edge of the bed with his arms open, and he waited for her to decide. She sat down on the edge of the bed. Her shoulders came forward. Her forehead found the front of his shirt, and his arms came around her very carefully. The way you hold something that has survived something it was not designed to survive, and they stayed like that for a long time. They cried without noise. Both of them. The way people cry when the grief has been waiting for the correct person to return it to and has finally at an unlikely hour found them. On the floor beside the bed, the knife lay still. On the morning before the wedding, Alcott knocked on Wren's door before she had come out for breakfast. He said, "The pendant I gave you before the warehouse." The W. She reached up and touched it through the fabric of her sweater. "There is something inside it," he said. "A chip, the size of a grain of rice, soldered shut between the two faces of the silver. I had it made the same day I had the pendant made." She looked at him. "That is how I found you," he said. When the dot stopped moving and stayed still for 51 minutes on a block in the South Bronx, I had 8 men in cars in 9 minutes. She stood in the doorway of her room and thought about that. She thought about what it meant that he had built that into something he called a gift, that he had given her something to hold and made it also something that would tell him where she was if the worst happened, and that he had done both of those things at the same time without explaining either of them. She thought about the 51 minutes the dot had been still and the 9 minutes and what those two numbers said about the distance between them and the speed at which he had crossed it. She took her hand off the pendant. "You could have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why did you not?" "Because I did not know yet which one of us needed it more," he said. "And I thought if you knew, you might not wear it." She considered that. She looked at him standing in the hallway in his dark suit on the morning of the day he intended to walk into a cathedral and hand 2 federal criminals to the government. And she thought about all the calculations he had been making for the last 3 weeks that she had seen and all the ones she had not. "I would have worn it anyway," she said. He nodded once. She thought she saw something move through his face at that something brief and quiet, and not quite relief, but adjacent to it. She went to breakfast. He followed. Donatella served eggs and did not ask questions, and the morning light came through the kitchen window in its usual, slightly warped and golden way, and the day continued. Saturday came the way significant things come, with the indifference of the calendar to human weight. St. Patrick's Cathedral had been dressed from the altar to the last pew in white lilies and winter roses, which had been arranged by a florist on Madison Avenue, whose invoice would never be paid in full. 400 guests filled the nave by 11 in the morning. The light through the clerestory windows came down in long columns through the incense and the cold and the particular stillness of a space that had absorbed 2 centuries of ceremony and had long ago stopped distinguishing between the genuine and the performed. Sylvia Hargrove descended the side aisle from the vestibule at 11:14 in a gown that had been fitted 4 times. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had walked into rooms like this in other cities under other names, and had never once in the hundreds of hours of preparation she had put into each of those entrances allowed herself to look like she was doing anything other than simply arriving. She was very good at this. She had been very good at it for a long time. She did not see anything in the faces of the assembled guests that gave her pause. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The only thing not where it was supposed to be was Dorian Alcott. He was 7 minutes late, then 9. Then the side door opened at 11:23, and he came through it alone. No best man, no attendant. He walked up the center aisle and reached the altar and turned to face the congregation, and Father O'Brien opened the order of service and lifted his eyes. Alcott raised one finger. "Father," he said, "forgive me." One moment. The bronze doors at the back of the cathedral opened. Agent Cora Fennick walked up the center aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral with 12 federal officers in plain clothes distributed behind her in the particular formation that communicated to anyone trained to read it that this was not a formation that asked for cooperation. It was a formation that had already decided on it. The nave went the kind of silent that 400 people produce when they all stop breathing at the same moment. Sylvia Hargrove turned her head very slowly toward the man at the altar. When she said, the word was not angry. It was the word of a craftsperson who had encountered a failure in a structure they had built carefully and wanted to understand the point of failure before anything else. "From the day a girl stopped my car at a red light," he said. His voice was entirely level. "And from everything that came after." Sylvia looked at him for one more second with an expression that was almost in its precision a form of professional respect. Then Cora Fennick reached the altar steps, and the expression went somewhere it would not be seen again. Sylvia Hargrove Fennick said, "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, forgery, and the attempted murder of 4 individuals across 3 countries in 2 decades. You have the right to remain silent." The cathedral did not erupt. It stayed silent in the way of rooms where something enormous has occurred too quickly for the ordinary mechanisms of response to engage. 400 people sat in the pews and watched the woman in the white gown have her wrists secured, and watched the federal officers move efficiently through the space, and watched Dorian Alcott stand at the altar with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing faces did when the machinery behind them had already moved on to the next problem. Corbin Hargrove was already in federal custody. He had been transferred 6 days earlier from the hospital in the Bronx, where his shoulder had been sutured, to a holding facility in Lower Manhattan. When the agents had checked his phone at intake, It showed the number he had been waiting to call, still unsaved in the outgoing log. He had been ready. He had just run out of time. Ward Tillman opened his apartment door at 1 in the afternoon to two men in unremarkable clothes and understood the situation before either of them had produced identification. He had understood it, Alcott thought later, from the moment the gray sedan with the scratched bumper had appeared on his block for the third time and had spent the intervening days hoping the understanding was wrong. It was not wrong. The Alcott family's formal involvement in the matter was on paper the involvement of a victim who had provided information to the appropriate authorities. The machinery of what came next belonged to Fennick and her department and the federal prosecutors who would spend the following year unwinding 7 years of careful, patient, methodical fraud across 4 cities. 3 families would receive notifications that cases previously closed as natural causes were being reopened. One family in Toronto would get a phone call that the man in the long-term care facility had provided the wine bottle to biochemical analysis and the results were no longer ambiguous. None of it would bring anyone back. Some accountings were like that. You could close the arithmetic without resolving the debt. Alcott had learned this before. He would carry it the same way he carried the other things that did not resolve, which was quietly and without asking anyone else to share the weight. The apartment on Green Street was quiet for 3 days after the wedding. Wren moved through it carefully the way she had moved through things her whole life, reading the atmosphere before committing to a direction. She spent the 3 days reading, which was something she had always done when her mind needed to work on a problem from a diagonal angle, which was the only angle at which certain problems could be approached. On the 4th day over breakfast, Alcott told her he was stepping down as head of the family. He would pass the chair to his cousin Antonio, who had been waiting with the patient readiness of someone who had understood for a long time that the chair would eventually be available. Alcott would keep the restaurants. He would keep the legitimate real estate. He would let the rest go. Wren listened to this and thought about it and said, "What do you do instead?" He thought about that for a moment. "Live," he said, and the word sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, the word of a man who had been using a different vocabulary for a long time and was adjusting to a new one. "I think I would like to try that for a while." She looked at him across the kitchen island. She thought about what living looked like for a man who had spent 17 years running 4 boroughs of New York. She thought about what it looked like for a girl who had spent 3 years in a steam tunnel with a whetstone and a plan. She thought they would probably both have to learn it more or less from scratch. "That seems reasonable," she said. He poured her more orange juice without being asked. Donatella served eggs. The morning light came through the kitchen window in its usual slightly warped and golden way. 6 months later, on a Tuesday morning in November in a courtroom on Adams Street in Brooklyn, a family court judge signed an order of adoption and looked over her reading glasses at the child seated across the room and said that in her many years on this bench, she had never received an application that had been supported by 3 separate character witnesses who each independently used the word exceptional. She directed the comment at Dorian Alcott, who was seated to Wren's left in a dark suit. He said "thank you" in the tone of a man receiving information he had already assessed independently. The judge looked at Wren. She asked if she understood what was being finalized today. Wren said yes. The judge signed the 2nd page of the order. She set down her pen. "Wren Calloway," she said, "is now Wren Alcott, effective immediately." The room did not erupt. It was a small room with institutional lighting and wooden benches and the faint smell of old paper. And the moment in it was not the kind that required space to expand into. It was a small, exact, permanent moment, the kind that you carried out of a room intact, rather than a room that became larger to contain it. Wren preferred those. She had always preferred precision to ceremony. She sat for 1 second with the order in her lap and read her own name on it in the judge's handwriting. Both parts of it, the old and the new. She folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket of her coat, the pocket she had sewn shut on 3 sides, the one that had been built for a knife that was no longer in it. They walked out of the courthouse into the November light. The house was in Park Slope, a narrow red brick row house on a block where a maple tree had grown so large over the years that its roots had lifted one corner of the sidewalk, and the city had paved around the roots rather than removed the tree, which Wren thought was the correct decision. The tree had been there longer than anyone on the block and had more stake in the sidewalk than the concrete did. She had a room at the back of the 2nd floor with a window that looked out onto a small garden where nothing was growing in November, but where she could see the geometry of it and understand that things would grow in spring. She put her books on the shelf in the order she had read them. She put the folded piece of paper from her mother's pocket, the one she had been carrying for 3 years, in a Ziploc bag to keep it from the weather, in the drawer of the small desk under the window. She put the velvet box with the silver pendant on the corner of the desk. She slept on the mattress. The first night she slept on the mattress, she woke 3 times and got up and checked the door and the window and lay back down. The second night she woke twice. The third night once. By the end of the first week, she was sleeping through until the gray came in at the window, which was the only alarm she had ever used. She started 4th grade at the public school 6 blocks away on a Monday in early December. The teacher was a woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who had been teaching 4th grade for 22 years and who had a way of looking at a new student that managed to be both assessment and welcome. At the same time, two things Wren appreciated having delivered simultaneously. She sat in the third row. The girl at the desk to her left was named Blythe and had braids and a collection of erasers shaped like small animals, and an opinion about every subject that she delivered with the energy of someone who had been waiting all day for the correct moment to share it. She told Wren on the first day that she had good handwriting, and on the second day that she had a very good eraser technique, which she demonstrated, and on the third day she brought an extra piece of pear cake in her lunch and set it on Wren's desk without explanation. By Friday, Wren understood that Blythe was her friend. She had not had a friend before. She had had Garrett, who was a teacher and a presence and someone she thought about and wondered about in the way you wondered about the people who had shaped you, but who was not a friend in the way that Blythe was a friend. She had had the black cat at Grand Central, who had always been where she expected it to be. She had had, in the most recent and most complicated category, the man 2 rooms down the hall. Blythe sent her a note on Friday afternoon that said her birthday was the following Saturday, and would Wren want to come, and there was going to be cake, and they were going to watch a movie. Wren folded the note and put it in her coat pocket and walked home through the November light under the maple tree that the city had paved around. And when she came through the front door and found Dorian in the kitchen reading the newspaper, she said, "I got invited to a birthday party," and held up the note. He looked at the note and then at her face. He said, "Good," and then he said, "What kind of cake?" And she said she did not know yet. He said that was an important detail and she should find out. She went upstairs to start her reading. That was how Saturdays began after that. On a Sunday in October the following year, they drove to Greenwood Cemetery in the early morning, before the city had fully committed to the day. The leaves on the maples along the cemetery road had turned the deep red that came before they fell, and the light was low and clean, and came through the trees in long bars that moved when the wind moved. Wren had the white lilies in her arms, wrapped in brown paper the florist had tied with string. She found the stone on the hill where she had found it before on the first visit she had made alone in the spring, to leave the first flowers and to sit for a while in the particular quiet that the city allowed this place and almost nowhere else. The stone was plain gray granite, the words cut clean. June Calloway, beloved mother. Wren crouched down. She unwrapped the lilies and laid them at the base of the stone, with the care of someone handling something that was precious in the way of things that could not be replaced. She smoothed the paper and set it aside. She put her hand flat on the grass and felt the cold come up through her palm and sat there for a moment with nothing in her head except her mother's face, the laugh lines and the tired eyes, and the hands that had carried things carefully and never spilled what they were not ready to spill. She was aware of Alcott stepping back half a pace to give her the space that the moment required. She was aware of the wind in the maples and a bird somewhere to the left and the distant sound of the city, which never entirely went away even here. After a while, she heard him move. She heard him come to the stone and lower himself to one knee in the grass on the other side. She heard him place something on the stone. She did not look. She waited. His voice, when it came, was the quietest she had ever heard it. "I will not ask you to forgive me," he said. "You were owed a life with her. You were owed every ordinary thing, and the extraordinary ones too, and none of that can be given back. I know that. I will know that every day I have left." He was quiet for a moment. "But I am here," he said, "and she is here. And I give you my word in front of her that I will spend every day I am given being worth the choice she made. Both of you." Wren looked at the stone. She looked at her mother's name cut clean in gray granite. She thought about the piece of paper in the desk drawer upstairs. Do not forget Alcott, the handwriting that she knew better than her own. She thought about what her mother had meant by writing that name and she thought that what she had meant was not what Wren had understood at 6 years old, which was a direction toward an ending. She thought that what her mother had meant was something she had come to understand only gradually over the months since the knife had come off the floor. She had meant, remember what you came from. Remember who you are. Remember that someone loved you enough to put your name in the last thing she held. Remember that. She reached across the stone and took Alcott's hand. His fingers closed around hers. They stayed for a while. The wind moved through the maples and the red leaves came down in ones and twos and landed in the grass around them, and the light shifted in the way that October light shifted golden and then grayer and then golden again, and the city went on at its distance as it always did, full of its own concerns and its own beautiful and different noise. When they stood and walked back down the red avenue under the turning trees, Wren kept hold of his hand. She thought about what she knew now that she had not known 3 years ago, which was many things, but mainly this, that the city had not seen her for 3 years, which she had used, and that one man had finally looked down from the height of everything he had built and seen her standing in the slush at a red light on Delancey Street, and that the looking had cost both of them considerably, and that she would not have changed it. She thought about the small, dry sound of the knife hitting the floor. She thought about how a sound could be a door closing and a door opening at the same time. She walked under the red maples of Greenwood Cemetery with her hand in the hand of the only family she had left, and November moved around them and the leaves came down, and somewhere in the deep grammar of the city that had raised her and hidden her, and finally, after everything let her be found, the name June Calloway was still present and would remain so, carried in two mouths that would not say it, lightly held by two people who understood what it meant to carry something without setting it down. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was in the only accounting that mattered everything.